So the form of 1984. There are lots of different ways of thinking about this. The most obvious and most frequently encountered term that is applied to 1984 is dystopia. It's considered by many people, many readers, to be the sort of dystopian work without better. It's very influential in the sort of the idea of thinking about what a dystopia might or can or should be. So filmic dystopias now, thinking about works like The Hunger Games or the Divergent series, those sorts of films, they owe a great deal, if not specifically to Orwell's novel, certainly to the climate of thought to which the novel led. And you can locate Orwell in some of these histories quite easily. Something that's important to bear in mind here, though, is that it's not a term Orwell himself used. So he didn't look at the book as a dystopia. He uses language like nightmare or utopia gone wrong, those sorts of ideas and that kind of phrasing. He's more interested in what the book has to tell us about ideals that can be thwarted, ideals that can be turned into the things they're not meant to be. And he uses the word perversion, so the perversion of a socialist ideal, in a statement that he issues shortly after the book was published as a sort of corrective to what he saw as its misinterpretations. That said, the word dystopia and the idea of dystopia is very helpful to us, and it can help us locate the book in literary history very effectively. I'll come back to that in a different lecture, though. The structure of the book is in some ways quite simple. It's a 3-act drama. It's classically what sometimes is called tripartite in form. We can think about this in terms of film trilogies again. So if you think of films like, the Star Wars trilogy, the more recent one, the Dark Knight films, again, Hunger Games, these are all trilogies. There's a sort of satisfying roundness to a trilogy. We could even think about it musically. Symphonies, for example, classical symphonies are often 3 parts, precisely because you can have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's very helpful narratively to do that, to structure a book in that way. The first part is the sort of instruction to the world. We learn about the world of 1984, about Oceania, about Airstrip 1, about Winston's place in it. The second part is where the tensions are built up. So part 2 of the novel is where things definitely start to go wrong. Part 3 of the book is where all of those conflicts are resolved. And as we know, not very well for Winston, but things draw in together. They're stitched back together in the third and final part. The plot, very simple. It's in some ways a romance. There's an introduction to the world of 1984 through Winston's eyes. The earlier parts of the book do the heavy lifting in terms of the exposition. That's where we learn most about what Oceania is like and what its priorities are. Winston meets his guide, who turns out to be his tormentor. That's O'Brien, the torturer. He's sent to the Ministry of Love, where he's purified, and that's meant to be in scare quotes, because as O'Brien describes him, he's kind of like a stain. That's O'Brien's word for Winston. He's a stain that must be wiped out and must be cleaned. And this is very loaded language. This is very politically sort of provocative and contentious language. And part of what Orwell is interested in here is really showing that sort of language up for what it is. It's a degrading, dehumanizing, humiliating kind of language. To talk about somebody as a stain, it's a terrible thing. But we have to ask, in a sense, is this really what happens? Is Winston in fact cured by the end? So is this 3-part structure one of resolution that leads to everything being sort of sewn up nicely and neatly for Winston? And really the question that hangs over the end of the book is, does Winston in fact come to love Big Brother by the end of it? We're told that he does, but it's not clear that he does. It's not clear based on the language that Orwell uses that that is actually what has happened. And this is something that I think is worth dwelling on as you read the book, as people argue over the book. How settled is its imagery? It's a very sort of dreamy, at times surreal narrative, and it can be quite hard to know what's happening at a given moment. And the language is ironic a lot of the time. There is a high degree of irony in 1984, and often this extends to the almost sort of playful use of language that Orwell's interested in. So although Winston endures a huge amount of pain and suffering, there is a small question mark that hangs over the end of the book. Is he in fact fully and finally broken down by his treatment at the hands of his torturers? This is a question that's very difficult to resolve. And this prompts us to a further thought about the form, which is that at one level the form is a kind of narrative convenience. So a three-part structure is very convenient for a storyteller because you set things up, you throw them into chaos, and then you bring them back together somehow. You do that. That's very useful for a writer. But it also indicates some important symbolic substitutions. So the world of the book moves from the general to the personal to the individual. So the general outline at the start gives way to the personal settings, the personal experiences of Winston and Julia primarily, their relationship, their romance. And then it gives way to Winston's experience fully at the end. And it's his story by the end. So in other words, just as the state closes in on Winston Smith, so too does the narrative. The narrative itself, as it proceeds, as it unfolds, increasingly comes to focus on its protagonist. And it's a sort of slow, unnerving, powerful, difficult attending to the reality of Winston's plight. Narratively, it's written in a third-person, sort of broadly realist style. It's closely focalized through the character of Winston Smith. And we can think about it sometimes using a cinematic metaphor. The camera is sort of over Winston's shoulder a lot of the time, but it sticks very closely to what he sees and what he thinks. But as I've said, it's also unexpectedly strange and fantastical and dreamlike at moments. There's a lot of references to dreams in 1984. It's a book about the mind. It's a book about how the mind can be warped and changed and moulded in accordance with the whims of a dictator. But it's also about how the mind is already itself very strange and is a place where people repress memories. So Winston is constantly haunted by the memory of betraying his mother as he sees it. He's also haunted by the memory of his past life, which he is increasingly unable to remember with any degree of accuracy. And I think a quotation here from a colleague of mine at Birmingham, Lindsay Stonebridge, is very useful in accounting for this. She writes, "As Winston writes, he begins to dream, and something of that dream logic seeps into the text, coaxing him into actions he cannot account for, taking him to places he had vowed not to go, making the familiar strange and the strange evocatively familiar." So this is a dream book. It's a dreaming book that dreams about something we definitely don't want to happen. But at the same time, it's a book about what dreams do and how they constitute people. Finally, I think we can also think of it as a morality tale. So this is very much a book about what's right and what's wrong, very simply put. And that's often how it's been read and sort of valued. It's concerned with what happens to individual rights when the state seeks to crush them out, to eradicate them. But it's also famously very contentious in how it represents one particular slice of individuals in society. So Orwell is working with a kind of hierarchical model of society in 1984. You have the inner party, the outer party, and then the proletarian classes outside it. And this broadly maps onto a high, middle, working class model of society. Orwell made sure that he put into Winston the view that the hope in this situation, so the hope that might defeat one day the Oceanian authorities, is the life, the sort of the barely conscious life that lives amongst the proles, the proletarians. And this is Winston's hope. This is what he holds on to, even when he's under the cosh and he's being beaten down in the most violent of ways by O'Brien. He still thinks that one day those people will rise up and defeat the state. The problem here, as critics famously, the most famous critic who's pointed this out is Raymond Williams, we don't ever really see anything from the proles' point of view. Everything that we learn about them is told to us through the eyes of others. And Winston's view that in the proles lies hope for the future of the society in which he lives and suffers is only something that he thinks. We only ever know this from his point of view. So we can bring this back to the formal structure of the book by saying that inasmuch as the book focuses increasingly on Winston Smith and gets closer to his viewpoint, although that's very helpful to us as interpreters of the novel, at the same time it raises certain important sort of ethical questions about what it is that Orwell is seeking actually to represent. If the Proles, for example, are the key source of hope in the book, why is it that they don't really ever become foregrounded in it? They're discussed a fair bit by Winston and Julia and O'Brien in particular, and Winston goes to a pub and he talks to some of them. But he comes out of that experience convinced really that they're not people who can give him anything, that he can't learn from, that he can't do anything with, or can only value as a sort of highly vulnerable, fragile thing on the peripheries of his consciousness. And that's not terribly helpful if you're looking in 1984 for a message of hope and that you can locate in a sort of realizable form of action. So the Proles, in as much as they're valued by Orwell and by Winston, are in other ways deeply problematic, the representation of them, that is. So this forces us to ask questions of Orwell as a novelist and as a thinker. This form helps him do certain things. It helps him get from plot beat to plot beat and to move throughout the story. But at the same time, it raises certain tricky questions for him about why he chooses to write in the way that he does.